All right, hello everyone. So I'm Casper, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Google Deployment Manager. I'm not really a huge expert on the subject, but I was kind of looking at the agenda for this meetup, and I could kind of felt like, since we were talking about Google Cloud and DevOps, it just a little bit like a missing piece of the puzzle. So I'll give you just a little bit of a taste of that. First, though, I'll just introduce myself. So I've been doing full stack web development for around 20 years. So I just really like, being all over the full stack, from operations and backend to front end, and playing around with games and 3D and everything. But right now, I'm at this super cool little startup called Drivers Node. We're 10 people right here in Copenhagen. I've been there only for about a year as a head of engineering. And since Drivers Node will also kind of be the case for this little talk, where I first got my hands dirty with Google Deployment Manager, I'll just tell you very briefly what it is. So Drivers Node is basically a mobile app, an app you install on your phone, and it tracks your car trips. And you can do it manually, start and stop, but you can also put in a little iBeacon, a little Bluetooth emitter that we sell, put it in the car, and then everything will happen automatically because the app will know when you're in the car and when to stop and start. And just very overall, so you have an idea, there's the phone talking to a Ruby on Rails backend using a Postgres database. So that's just very quickly on the stack that we're deploying. We have around 500,000 users worldwide. We're in over 50 countries, and kind of size-wise, we have a database that's a lot smaller than IKEA's, but still big enough to be a challenge when you're just on a single box, as we were earlier. Also a growing amount of flat files. These used to be big daunting numbers, but when you're in the cloud, luckily it's not a problem. So that's nice for us and everyone else, because when you are a small startup with a lot of growth, these numbers grow really, really fast. So our infrastructure setup, just to get an idea what it is that we're setting up with Deployment Manager, we are on Google Cloud. We'd kind of have to be to use Deployment Manager. I'll just spend a few minutes just telling you about the actual setup here. You don't need to be able to read all the details here. I know that you can't, but it's more to give you an idea about what kind of resources is it that we're actually deploying. Google Cloud has something called App Engine, which is a little bit similar to Heroku, kind of a very easy way to deploy apps with using a language that they support, and you don't really have to worry about Docker or Kubernetes or any of that stuff, which was nice to me because I'm not really much of a DevOps. I just like to be able to push stuff out and it works. So our Rails backend is deployed to App Engine. We also use Sidekick, which is like for running jobs, background jobs. So that's another set of deployment instances that we have there. We have Postgres, as I mentioned. We have some cloud storage on Google solution there, and we have something that they call memory store, but it's really just Redis, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So those kind of building blocks are the main chunks of what we're deploying to the Google Cloud. So, Deployment Manager. Let me tell you a bit more about why we actually decided this, because when I joined Drivers Node a year ago, we kind of knew that we were moving to the cloud, and we decided on Google Cloud. But then we also have to figure out even though I'm not much of a DevOps, I had heard about this whole infrastructure as a code thing. I wanted to do as all the cool kids, so it would kind of feel bad if I just went into the nice web interface and start setting things up, right? I wouldn't feel good with myself. I wouldn't really be able to sleep at night if I knew that all the stuff I'd set up on the staging project, I would have to do it all over again. I would be a bad DevOps if I did that, right? So I was looking into kind of different options here, like what could you really do? I didn't really have any experience with Docker or Kubernetes. I didn't really have any experience with Terraform or any other of these kind of modern cross cloud providers. So I kind of thought it was pretty obvious to look into what Google had to offer themselves. I thought, well, Google is offering a lot of good stuff, so this will probably be good as well. I mean, we'll get back to that. So what Deployment Manager is, that it is Google's infrastructure as a code product, and you basically have the configuration in YAML files, but you can have them in something called Jinja, I believe it's called, or you can have them in Python templates. And then you use the Google Cloud SDK to execute these configurations against some Google Cloud project. And just to give you an idea about the kind of core concepts of the Deployment Manager, so you have a configuration which will typically cover some set of resources for a product. We only have one configuration because we're deploying a single product, and you have resources underneath those, and its resources are basically anything that the Deployment Manager can deploy, right? So it can be a bucket, it can be a service account, it can be a server, it can be anything really. And those resources, well, they have properties, and then they can be organized into templates, which you can do in either this Jinja thing, which I haven't really looked into, or you can use Python, which I understand a little bit better. So let me show you an example, and let's see how easy it is to see this. Just as bad as for everything else. So I don't know if we should dim the lights, just so people have a chance of actually seeing what's happening here. All right. So, and I'll step a little bit aside so you can see anything at all. So the starting point for a deployment manager is a YAML file. You always start with a YAML file, and you could choose to, if you had a very, very simple project, to just put everything in the YAML file. But what you typically do is you reference something else. I like to have my stuff in Python files. So what you can see here is that we're basically importing some Python files that we want to use, and then we're saying the only resource I want to reference here is my kind of master Python file, and then I wanna output some stuff down here. Maybe I have some auto-generated passwords or something that I want to output and take a note of, some names, something. Let's dive a little bit into. Oops, there's the slide here, which I should remember to mention here, is that I'm referencing something up here called, I don't know if you have any chance of reading this, something called a bucket file. This is actually one of the many templates that Google offers for the Deployment Manager. So you can go into to this GitHub project here and find a long list of samples and templates for different kind of things you want to set up on the Google platform. And that I have found very helpful because you certainly don't find all your answers in documentation. So what does the Python file then look like? Well, you you have a function that needs to be called generate config, and it needs to return a list of resources. It needs to return an array of hashes that tells you what resources you want to generate with the deployment manager. And the way I like to set it up is to just have different sub-functions that you then call into. In this example here, we want to do something very simple. We want to set up a service account, and we want to add a bucket on the Google Cloud Storage, which the service account gets access to. And just to show you the nitty-gritty of what it actually looks like, adding a service account with Deployment Manager is quite easy. You have a name here. That's the internal name in Deployment Manager that you simply use for referencing, and I'll show you how that works. You have the type, which is this very interesting kind of namespacey string that you'll kind of find yourself looking up all the time. So you don't need to write this down. It's very easy to find on Google, but there's basically a very long list, but not long enough, list of resources that the deployment manager can set up, and you'll be looking up those a lot. And then you have the actual properties of the resource. In the case of a service account, you can do it very, very simple. You can give it an account ID and some kind of display name. Just to show you a little bit of more of an advanced example, the function that creates a cloud bucket in the storage is referencing not directly the type, but the template Python file right here. And then it's actually passing on properties not directly to the resource, but properties that are supported by the bucket template. So from the deployment manager's point of view, it doesn't really care whether you're creating a resource directly or whether you're passing them into a template file. As long as this ends up returning something that the deployment manager can understand, then it's happy. And even though this may already start to look a little bit complicated, then it still helps to use templates like this to kind of generate exactly what is expected, because you should know about the deployment manager that it's kind of very API near, right? It mirrors what the actual REST APIs to create and update resources can do. So one thing I also just wanted to highlight here is that, and that still, I hope you have a chance of seeing it a little bit. Maybe I know the front row can see at least. You'll have to tell the rest of the guys down behind. Down here, we're actually setting up the role. So we're using the service account that we created in the other step. So we're saying this service account should have the storage object admin role on the bucket that we're creating. And we are referencing this specific service account by using this special $ref syntax that we use in deployment manager configurations, and then referencing the internal name that we gave it up here is what we also put down here, and then we actually go .email, which is an identifier that Google Cloud has generated for us. But the important thing about this is that this also helps Deployment Manager to understand the order in which to create resources, because that you know, you can't create the bucket before you have created the service account, because it needs the service account to be able to create it and put the right role on it. So now that we have a simple configuration creating a service account and a bucket, what do we do with it? So you use the G Cloud SDK to run commands with the deployment manager. When you create a new deployment, you give it some kind of name that is meaningful to you. You give it the path to the configuration YAML file, the first one I showed you, which is the entry point to everything else, and you tell it what project you want to apply it to. And then from there, it will do its magic and start setting it up, or just as likely, you will have made a very, very small mistake and it will fail miserably. But at least in theory, this is how it works. And updating is very similar. Once you have created a deployment, you can't create it again. You can destroy it or you can update it. Typically, unless you're playing around, you'll want to update it with a very similar syntax, except that you can add this delete policy, which is kind of nice. The default delete policy is to remove resources, but since I don't really trust my own ability to not mess up things, I prefer to use a delete policy of abandon, where it will just like remove its tags on the resources, but it will actually leave the resources there. So since it's quite a small setup, it's easy for me to see if something was left there. The other thing you can put on when you're doing updates is you can put this preview tag on, which is very similar to what Daniel was showing before. So you can get an idea about what it's going to do. But of course, just as with Terraform, you won't really know if it will work until you actually apply it, which you do by running the same command without the preview tag. So with that, I'll just, as promised, tell you a little bit about what I think, like what are the good and the bad and the ugly aspects of the deployment manager. I'll start out with what I like. So I really like that, it's an official Google Cloud product. It has full support available. We have a support agreement with Google Cloud, so I can write to their support and get help when things are messy. I can get help on Slack and so on. The price tag is also really nice because it's completely free to use. And I also really like that I'm free to write my infrastructure code in Python. And I like that I don't have to pay and rely on a third party for my infrastructure, since I'm already relying on Google. I don't really feel I need to bring in more players in to take my money and mess things up if I can avoid it. There's also a few issues with Deployment Manager, I should say. I think like what came as the biggest surprise to me was that you would probably expect that since it's Google's own deployment product, they should also support all of their own cloud resources. But they don't, actually far from it. And it appears to be a little bit random whether the teams that do the individual types of resources decide to expose an API that the deployment manager can then use. It seems to be very like loosely coupled as far as I can figure out. So, for example, I'd had to write quite a lot of scripting that are not deployment manager code, but that are just Python code. So, for instance, this is an excerpt from our actual kind of full provisioning script. So I have to enable APIs, I have to create a runtime config, enable the app engine, create memory store instances, and then down here I actually call run deployment manager, and just to show a little bit more into what is going on here. All of these is simply just calling out gcloud SDK commands, which is also why it's a little bit puzzling to me that Deployment Manager does not support them, because clearly there is some way to interact with them, right? Or I wouldn't be able to make these gcloud calls. But I have to then manage, for instance, code for creating a memory store instances myself. And if I want to change, let's say, the capacity on my Redis, I can't go in and just make an infrastructure change in deployment manager in my code and have it as a nice Git commit. I actually have to either run the SDK command or go into the web interface and make that change. So right there, my kind of nice infrastructure as a code illusion is broken a little bit. That's how it is with deployment manager. Also, the documentation is below Google Cloud's normal standard, I'd say. You often have to dig quite a lot around to find your answers, and also whoever wrote the documentation for deployment manager has kind of taken a shortcut and kind of just linked to all the API documentation, which then don't know anything about deployment manager, so you don't get a lot of good documentation in the context of deployment manager. You only get the generic API documentation and then generic documentation about deployment manager. So that's a little bit bad, I think. But there are also things that are ugly. And one of them is actually kind of also related to what Daniel was mentioning he experienced with Terraform. Since both products are talking to Google Cloud, you can experience this exact thing that he mentioned, where it will fail in some obscure way. And I had the problem early on that I have done this thing with just I was playing around, so I was creating deployments, removing them, creating, removing, but I couldn't. It keeps failing for some reason when I did it with the database, and it took a long time before I realized that it was this exact thing that I couldn't reuse the same name, because they don't really delete them. They keep them for a week or however long, so that you can still write into support and say, "Oh, they deleted my database by mistake. Please recover it." And maybe they'll do that. But you didn't get a nice error message out saying you need to use another name. This name is already taken. You just got some obscure, really obscure SQL internal error bleepbot fail, right? So I don't really like that, because that's just wasting my time. Also, I don't really fully trust it, especially not with our database. Because I have provisioned our database with deployment manager, but if I want to give it more RAMs or more CPUs or whatever, I'm not going to do it via deployment manager, because I simply don't trust it enough to be sensible about that particular deployment. Because if you with Cloud SQL, at least, there are some settings that you can just change, and there are some settings that will restart the database, and then you're down for a couple of minutes, and that's not very good. So I have to say, whenever I don't let it touch the database, I put it in a separate kind of deployment configuration, and whenever I do use deployment manager to update our other stuff, like add a new bucket or change some permissions, I'm always a little bit scared to see if it messes something up. It hasn't been too far so far. I haven't messed up anything in production, at least, but it doesn't feel like this really mature product that I feel that I can just trust and be safe with. So with that, I've told you everything I know about deployment manager. Thank you.